You know that feeling when you look at someone you've known for decades and realize you don't recognize them anymore. Not because they've changed physically, though they might have, but because something essential has shifted, and you can't pinpoint exactly when the person you loved became someone you're not sure you even like. This is the story of Marcus and Elena, friends since childhood, who watched their bond dissolve not in a spectacular rupture, but through the quiet accumulation of small betrayals, misunderstood words, and the gravitational pull of lives moving in different directions. By the end, they were strangers sharing a history neither knew how to discuss. Marcus and Elena met in 4th grade when Elena moved next door to Marcus's family. She was shy, had recently emigrated, and spoke with an accent that the other children mocked. Marcus, without any particular heroism, simply sat next to her at lunch and shared his sandwich. That single act of casual kindness became the foundation for what would be a 32-year friendship, the kind that felt like it would inevitably last forever. They did everything together through their teenage years. Walked to school, studied in each other's bedrooms, attended the same university where they lived in adjacent dorms. They knew each other's families, each other's first loves, each other's deepest insecurities. Elena knew that Marcus feared he wasn't smart enough despite being genuinely brilliant. Marcus knew that Elena's confident exterior masked persistent self-doubt about her belonging. They were each other's safe place, the person you could call at 3 in the morning with an irrational fear and know they'd listen without judgment. They had inside jokes that spanned decades, shorthand for complex emotions, a shared language that outsiders couldn't quite penetrate. When people asked Marcus about his best friend, he'd say Elena without hesitation. When Elena spoke about the people she trusted most, Marcus was always first on the list. Their 20s were spent in parallel growth. Marcus pursued architecture. Elena studied medicine. They'd get coffee between classes and update each other on their lives, their dreams, their fears about the future. They double-dated occasionally, though neither of their respective partners felt entirely comfortable with how close Marcus and Elena were. There was no romantic element between them. Both were certain of this, but there was an intimacy that sometimes made their significant others uneasy. Marcus got married first to a woman named Catherine who worked in finance. Elena was his best man. She'd asked him to make an exception and let her stand on his side of the aisle. Catherine had smiled and agreed, though Marcus detected the smallest flicker of something that looked like resignation. Elena gave a toast about how lucky Catherine was, how Marcus was the most loyal person she'd ever known. She meant it, and everyone heard the depth of that affection. Elena took longer to marry. She dated several people, never quite finding the right fit, always comparing them against some standard she had trouble articulating. Marcus suspected she was comparing them against him, against what she expected a partner to provide, based on what their friendship had provided. When Elena finally got engaged to a surgeon named James, Marcus felt something shift. Not jealousy exactly, but a recognition that their dynamic had fundamentally changed. By their early 30s, both were busy with marriages and careers. They still talked regularly, still met for dinner once a month or so, but the texture of their friendship had altered. Conversations that used to meander for hours now felt compressed, efficient. They updated each other on their lives but didn't share them in the same way. Marcus had less time for late-night phone calls. Elena had built a new social circle through her hospital work. The intimacy was still there, but it was thinner, more durable but less nourishing. The first real crack appeared when Marcus was promoted to senior architect at his firm. It was a position Elena had encouraged him to pursue, and when he got it, he called to tell her immediately. She congratulated him, but something in her voice felt off. Later, Marcus would realize that Elena had been passed over for a senior position at her hospital around the same time. She'd been competing for the role against someone less experienced and had felt the decision was political rather than merit-based. Marcus didn't know about the rejection when he celebrated with Elena. He assumed her muted response was just exhaustion from a long shift. But Elena internalized it differently. She told herself that Marcus had always succeeded easily, that things came naturally to him, that his promotion somehow diminished hers by contrast. It wasn't rational, but it was how she felt. She didn't tell Marcus any of this. Instead, she let it sit, a small stone in her chest that she'd occasionally touch to remind herself it was there. Around the same time, Marcus and Catherine decided to have children. They tried for several years without success and went through fertility treatments. Elena, who desperately wanted children, had to sit with her friend through the process, celebrating when treatments succeeded, mourning when they failed. She was a good friend about it. She showed up, she listened, she didn't make it about her own longing. But internally, she was keeping score. Marcus would eventually have children. Elena might not. Elena confided in Marcus about her struggles to get pregnant. Marcus was supportive, suggested they'd keep trying, offered to help however he could. But Catherine made a comment once, Elena overheard it, about how Elena was obsessing over having children. The comment was meant lightly, but Elena heard judgment in it. She started to wonder if Marcus was telling Catherine things Elena had shared in confidence, secrets told to him as her closest friend, but received by his wife as gossip to be analyzed and commented on. The friendship began to fray at its edges. Elena started keeping more of her life private. When she finally did get pregnant after 3 years of fertility treatment, she told James before she told Marcus. Marcus was hurt, confused. He'd been part of Elena's journey through the struggles. Why hadn't he been the first to know about the success? Elena's explanation, that she wanted to protect the pregnancy, feared jinxing it, felt like an excuse to him. Marcus had his first child, a daughter named Sophie, 2 months after Elena's positive pregnancy test. Elena was happy for him, genuinely, but she was also grieving what she didn't have yet. She attended Sophie's birth, was present in the hospital, held the baby, and felt the weight of her own longing. She performed joy because that's what friendship required, but inside she was calculating the gap between her experience and his. Then Eleanor had a miscarriage at 5 months. She called Marcus in the hospital, devastated, and he came immediately, leaving Catherine at home with Sophie. He held Elena while she cried, spoke to doctors, advocated for her care. He was exactly the friend she needed in that moment. But when Catherine picked him up, Marcus left to go home because Catherine needed him, because Sophie needed him. Elena felt the full weight of his other life, the family that took priority over her crisis. She didn't tell him that feeling at the time. Instead, she carried it forward, let it accumulate with other grievances. Marcus had children. Elena did not. Marcus had built a nuclear family that consumed his time and attention. Elena had her marriage, which was good but different. Marcus had prioritized his family over their friendship in ways that felt natural, but also felt like abandonment. Elena knew this was unfair, knew Marcus hadn't done anything wrong, but she felt it anyway. Elena eventually had another child, a son, 18 months after the miscarriage. By then, Marcus had 2 children and was talking about wanting a third. Their lives had genuinely diverged. Marcus spent weekends at children's birthday parties and soccer games. Elena did the same, but less frequently, with different intensity. They still tried to maintain their friendship, but it required conscious effort now, scheduled coffee dates that sometimes got cancelled for sick children or unexpected work emergencies. Marcus didn't notice how distant Eleanor had become until it was nearly complete. When he did notice, he tried to address it. He called and asked if everything was okay. Elena said she was fine, just busy with work and the kids. Marcus suggested they plan a weekend trip, just the 2 of them, like old times. Elena said maybe, but it never materialized. When Marcus pushed a little harder, asking if he'd done something to upset her, Elena broke. She told him that she felt abandoned, that his family had consumed him, that she was no longer a priority in his life. She told him that he'd never truly understood what it meant for her to struggle with infertility while watching him have children easily. She told him that his marriage, specifically Catherine, had changed him, made him less available to her. She told him that she felt like she'd lost her best friend to his other life. Marcus was shocked and defensive. He argued that he'd been there when she needed him, that he couldn't help having children, that it wasn't fair to resent him for his family. He said that Elena's expectations of him were unrealistic, that friendships had to adapt as people's lives changed. He said that if Elena resented his wife and his children, then she was resenting fundamental parts of who he was. Elena heard in his response a confirmation of what she'd been feeling, that she no longer fit into Marcus's life in the way she once had. Rather than fighting to find a new way to be friends, she simply withdrew. She stopped initiating contact. When Marcus reached out, she responded politely but briefly. She declined his invitations. She created distance, not as a punishment exactly, but as a form of self-protection. This went on for several years. They were still in each other's lives nominally. They exchanged Christmas cards, attended each other's children's milestones, ran into each other occasionally at mutual friends' events. But the friendship that had been the center of both their lives had become something peripheral. They were cordial, but the intimacy was gone entirely. Marcus tried to repair things once. He reached out and suggested they talk, really talk, about what had happened to their friendship. Eleanor agreed reluctantly. They met at a coffee shop, the same one where they'd met for coffee thousands of times before, but this time, sitting across from each other felt awkward in a way it never had. They didn't know how to navigate the conversation, because navigating it required acknowledging pain that both had been avoiding. Marcus said he missed her, missed their friendship. Elena said she missed him too, but there was something resigned in the admission. She said the friendship they'd had wasn't sustainable anymore, that maybe it had run its course naturally. Marcus argued against this, said friendships didn't have expiration dates, that theirs was too deep to lose. Elena said that maybe it had already been lost, that they were just good at pretending to maintain something that no longer existed. They sat in painful silence for a while. Marcus asked if there was anything he could do to fix this. Elena said there wasn't, that it wasn't about something Marcus had done wrong exactly. It was about how their lives had diverged, how their needs had become incompatible, how trying to force the friendship back into its previous shape was impossible because they weren't the same people anymore. She was being honest, but it felt like cruelty. What Elena didn't articulate even to herself was that she'd been grieving the friendship for years. She'd built up a narrative where Marcus had betrayed her by being happy in ways she wasn't, by having things she wanted, by moving into a life that required less of their bond. The betrayal was imaginary, but felt real. Marcus hadn't done anything to her. He'd simply lived his life, and Elena had interpreted that living as a form of abandonment. The conversation ended without resolution. They exchanged hugs, the kind that are performed rather than felt, and went back to their separate lives. This time it was definitive. They saw each other at mutual friends' gatherings and were pleasant, but the friendship was over. They were strangers now, people who happened to share history but no longer shared a present. Years passed. Marcus sometimes thought about Elena, wondered how she was doing, wanted to reach out but couldn't figure out how to bridge the gap that had formed. Elena thought about Marcus too, but by then she'd rewritten the story in a way that felt safer. She told herself he'd been a different person than she'd thought, that the friendship hadn't been as meaningful as she'd believed. It was a lie, but it was a lie that protected her from the truth of her own role in its dissolution. When Marcus's mother died, Elena went to the funeral. She sat in the back and listened to the eulogy, watched Marcus grieve. Afterward, she approached him and they stood together for a moment, and Elena could see the boy she'd known in 4th grade still living somewhere inside the adult he'd become. But that boy was inaccessible now, locked behind years of distance. They didn't know how to speak to each other anymore. Marcus's sister mentioned to him afterward that Elena had come, that she'd seemed sad about his mother's death. Marcus realized that Elena probably had loved his mother, had spent years around her, had history with her. But Marcus hadn't known that Elena came to the funeral. They'd drifted so far apart that he wouldn't have known what Elena did or didn't do in times of crisis. Looking back, neither Marcus nor Elena could identify the exact moment the friendship died. There was no dramatic betrayal, no single incident that shattered what they had. It had simply faded, starved by neglect and watered with resentment. They'd both been so focused on how the other person wasn't showing up that they hadn't noticed they were both walking away. The tragedy of it, I think, is that it was entirely preventable. If Marcus had said to Elena, "I notice we're drifting and I don't want to lose you," perhaps she would have heard him. If Velena had said to Marcus, "I'm struggling with my own grief and I'm making you into the source of it," perhaps he would have understood. But neither said those things, and the silence became so complete that speaking became impossible. Years after the friendship's end, Eleanor ran into Catherine at a grocery store. Catherine was friendly, asked how Eleanor was doing, and Eleanor realized that Catherine probably didn't even know their friendship had ended. To Catherine, it was just something that naturally faded over time, the way many friendships do. Catherine probably hadn't been thinking about Elena at all, which somehow made the estrangement feel more final. I want to thank you for following this story through to its conclusion, for witnessing how friendship can become strangeness without dramatic rupture, through the slow accumulation of distance and misinterpretation. If this chronicle has resonated with you, particularly if you've experienced the loss of a friendship that once felt permanent, I encourage you to subscribe to our channel and become a member. Your support helps us continue telling these stories about the relationships that shape us and the ways we sometimes let them slip away. Join our community and help us explore the complex terrain of human connection, the bonds that last and the ones that don't, and what we can learn from both.